Hey guys, it's Hannah, and today I'm going to be doing a book review on Torture Man by Warren Adler. So I was sent an advanced copy of Torture Man by the publisher Stonehouse Productions in exchange for an honest review, and today I'm going to be doing that review for you guys. So even though I was sent this book for review, just a disclaimer, all opinions are still 100% honest and 100% my own. So essentially this book follows the storyline of two different kind of main characters. First, it follows the story of Sarah Robb, who is a human rights activist and works in the Amnesty office in New York. And the second character that the story follows is Carl Hellman, who is a CIA operative. Essentially, he works for the CIA and he works specifically in torture and interrogation. So Sarah and Carl's storylines end up intersecting when one day they take a cab together and a train to get to where they're trying to go, and they end up having a conversation and figuring out that they both have very opposing ideologies when it comes to torture and war and just terrorism in general. The story is really focused on terrorism in the US, torture, and whether or not that torture is moral or immoral. You don't really get a solid opinion stated in this book, but you get two very contrasting opinions and you get to see how those opinions kind of play out. So the main plot of this story really unfolds when Sarah's daughter Rachel ends up getting kidnapped by some people, and she has to call Carl in and work with the one person who she thought that she would never be working with. So going into this book, I was actually really anticipating reading it because I love controversial topics. I love politics, and I love reading about things like that, and I love reading about people's different contrasting ideas and ideologies and kind of forming my own opinions on those. I think that the premise of this story was very interesting, and that really drew me in when I first started reading it because I was anticipating where the plotline was going to go. So the first third of this book really just lays out both Sarah and Carl's opposing ideologies and how the two of them feel about this whole topic of torture and terrorism. Sarah, being a human rights activist, is very, very strongly opposed to torture and terrorism and war in general, and Carl, being a CIA interrogator who has partaken in this torture itself, is very much on the other side of the spectrum and is not opposed to it, even though he does feel some of its repercussions. However, after about 100 pages or so in and about a 300-page book, that's when all the action finally starts to take place, and that's where I started to have most of my problems with this book. Now, I had two really big problems with this book. So first of all, one of my biggest problems was I did not like the way that the female characters were portrayed, and I really didn't like how a lot of them were treated throughout this book. Sarah, the main character, I felt like was treated fairly well. However, there was another character in this book who had committed a crime, and instead of being blamed for the crimes that she had in fact committed, she was slut-shamed a lot of the time, and she had derogatory terms thrown at her over and over again that were all based around her sexuality and not the actual crime that she had committed. And I just found that extremely frustrating and really difficult to read, and there were points in this book where there were characters who were being threatened with rape, and that just didn't sit well with me. And I understand that this book has to do with torture, but I really couldn't read those parts, and they made me feel so uncomfortable, and I honestly was so upset by them that it was sometimes difficult to continue reading the book. I don't really know how someone else could actually feel comfortable reading those parts, but maybe some other people would have an easier time getting through them, but personally I just couldn't. The torture that took place in this book, in fact, was also really difficult for me to read. Not that I've never read torture in a book before, but the problem for me was that all of the torture was being done on the female characters in this book, and it just became really, really uncomfortable and really, really disturbing. And maybe someone else, like I said, would feel a little bit more comfortable reading that, but it was so degrading and I honestly felt so uncomfortable. So overall, like I said, the treatment of the female characters, the representation of them, it didn't sit well with me, and I understand that it's a book about torture, but threatening someone with rape, I feel like, is just kind of crossing a line that I don't think should be crossed. The other thing about this book that I really struggled with was the representation of Islam and Muslims and just people from Middle Eastern countries in general. Now, there were several times, I will point out in this book, that the characters did say that not all people who are Muslim, not all of the Middle East, not all Islamic countries are like these specific people that were being portrayed in this, but there were still lots of slurs and lots of demeaning just phrases and words that were thrown around, and just attitudes towards those characters in this book that, again, didn't sit well with me at all. And even though those parts were in there when they were saying that it's not all people who are like this, it just felt like the attitude towards those characters and just the way that they were written and described made it seem like that was the attitude that was being portrayed towards them, and that was the opinion that the characters had of them, even when they said that that's not what they felt. And I know I'm being kind of vague about this, but I don't really want to give any spoilers away for the actual story and who the actual characters are. But overall, just the representation of the Muslim characters and the Middle Eastern characters in this book, and just the Middle East in general, was just, in my opinion, very skewed, and I felt like it was coming from a somewhat biased perspective. I feel like you really didn't honestly get both sides, even though you did have the dichotomy of Sarah's liberal character and Carl's more conservative character. And personally, I am no expert on Islam or the Middle East or terrorism or torture or the CIA or any of this information at all. I do have my own personal opinions, but I still feel like it was a biased representation, and I felt like it was somewhat of a prejudiced representation that just kind of fit into stereotypes rather than actual representations of these people. And I think that was really the big thing. I feel like the female characters and the Muslim characters, the characters who were supposed to be the terrorists, were all stereotypes, and they weren't actually developed into real life representations of people, like what people are actually like. I felt like they were just very much these stereotypes that we see in modern day society. So overall, I thought that the plot was very interesting. I thought that it was just an interesting concept in general. I thought that it was an interesting contrast between Carl and Sarah's two very opposing viewpoints. But like I said, those 2 points, the representation of the women and the treatment of the women in this book, and also the stereotypes of the Muslim Middle Eastern characters in this book, were just not my cup of tea, and they really didn't sit well with me. So for that reason, I rated this book a 2.5 stars because, like I said, I thought that it had a very promising premise, and I thought that the subject was something that was definitely worth reading about and definitely worth having a conversation about. But those 2 points really brought it down for me, because it was just very difficult for me to read and very uncomfortable for me to read, and just, like I said again, didn't sit well with me at all. Now, even though I did give it a low rating, and even though a lot of the parts didn't sit well with me, I feel like this is still a very good conversation starter of a book. Like, I feel like if you were to read this, you could definitely have a good discussion about it, about what you did like and what you didn't like, and I feel like it has merit in that sense. But like I said, personally, it was very difficult for me to get past those 2 aspects of this book. So that is it, guys. That is it for my review on Torture Man by Warren Adler. So let me know in the comments down below if you're interested in controversial political topics, if you like reading books about that type of stuff, and if you do, leave some recommendations down below, because I definitely love to read more of that stuff, because it's something that greatly interests me. And I feel like most of the time, at least, I do very much enjoy reading those types of topics. Also, let me know in the comments down below if there are any other books that you guys would like to see me do a review on, if I have read it recently, or if you want me to read it and then review it. Let me know that in the comments down below as well. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye! I haven't reread this series since the first time that I read them. I've read individual books a couple of times, but I haven't read the whole thing from the first book to the